The group Exat 51, so we start with Exat 51 rather than TOC, the group Exat 51 have a reputation as the first Yugoslav art group to demonstratively break from socialist realism, famously issuing a manifesto to protest against the domination of socialist realism at a meeting of the Croatian Association of Applied Arts in December 1951, only a few years after the Tito-Stalin split of 1948. Exat 51 argued forcefully that abstract art also has a place in the development of socialist reality. They were a strong interdisciplinary group made up of architects, designers, and artists, and therefore it came naturally for them to press for a synthesis of the applied and fine arts in order to enrich the field of visual communication and to open up new possibilities for artistic experimentation. Despite the fact that in practice they only realized a few exhibitions until the group disbanded in 1956, and these exhibitions were dominated by the work of the painters in the group rather than true synthetic experiments that were anticipated in their manifesto of 51, they have a very prominent position in Croatian art history.
2 decades later, another interdisciplinary group was launched in Zagreb, although their reputation in national art history is much more disputed than that of Exat 51. The group TOC did not write a manifesto, though it did announce the group's arrival by publishing an article entitled "City as Total Happening" that justified their approach and set out their artistic program. While Exat 51 broke with socialist realism, Group TOC expressed a critical position towards the formalist qualities of much of contemporary art that appeared in public places of Zagreb in the year of 1971. And they directed their attention towards concrete social issues arising from the rapid transformation of the urban environment, and this aspect of their practice is the focus of our paper. Like Exat 51, TOC were also concerned with the notion of synthesis, although in their case it went beyond the call for unity of applied and fine arts and architecture towards a more integrated understanding of the relation of arts, people, and environment.
As the architect of the group, Davor Lončarić explains, and this is another definition of synthesis, we've had already quite a few, synthesis entails the complete and consistent forming of space, the complex problematic of which calls for the contribution of a wide range of art professionals whose task is to deal with the total environment. He takes up a critical position towards the work of the leading architectural historian of the time, Siegfried Gideon, whose space-time architecture was freshly available in Serbian translation since 1969 when it came out in Serbian. Lončarić distinguishes his position from that of Gideon, for whom the synthesis of art was a sum rather than a structure, and reflected a mythical attitude rather than a scientific one that approaches every problem by finding adequate method and means. A truth synthesis requires that one deals with, quote, the visual before it becomes a painting, with plastic before it becomes a sculpture, the acoustic before it becomes a song, and with the dynamic tectonic before it becomes architecture, in order to fully and consistently shape the space. For Lončarić, the environment includes not only nature, architecture, or roads, but also mass media, people, intimacy, warmth, traffic, politics, and rubbish, and is formed through aspects of intervention, education, literature, politics, and ecology. In that way, the total happening of the environment is defined by its relation to a specific time and place and is communicated through the theatre, which is a, quote, primordial mixed media that should be developed further.
In 1972, the 7th Zagreb Salon, which was an annual exhibition, and it had for the second time a section entitled Proposal, which was envisaged for young and more experimental art practices. And they invited artists to suggest interventions in public space under the slogan, City Space for Plastic Happening. In the first edition, in 1971, memorable public works were realized, such as Ivan Kožarić's Grounded Sun and Braća Dimitrijević's Casual Passers-by. However, what the socialist critics, art critics, praised most was Boris Buchan's drawing on the shadows of buildings on the walls and pavements in the center of the city, which was interpreted as beautifully clean and as a work that appropriately understood the rules and aesthetic criteria of public art. The 1972 edition of Proposal had the sub-theme Human Environment, and it was conceived in the same way as the previous one through an open call for artistic proposals. It was in fact in response to this call that a circle of friends who were studying in Zagreb University and mostly originated from the coastal town of Rijeka, they came together to form the interdisciplinary group TOK. The name TOK translates as flow, which is also symptomatic for their fluid artistic attitudes.
So, along with the architect and writer Davor Lončarić, who we already met, the core members of the group were art history and comparative literature student Vladimir Gudac and Dubravko Budic, who was a painter and graphic designer. They were somehow the core of the group. There were also 3 other signatories to their proposal, namely Ivan Šimunović, Gustav Zechel, and Darko Zubčević, who they socialized with intensely at the time, and who also signed the proposal, but these people eventually withdrew from the activities of the group, some of them even before the exhibition, before the Salon exhibition. In later manifestations of the group's activities, notably trips to Belgrade and Graz in 1973, TOK was also joined by a clique of followers who had their own subversive acronym, BNK, which could be politely translated as, "We don't give a damn about Group TOK."
Under the title,
if you want the other one, we can maybe discuss it later.
Under the title, The City as Total Happening, Group TOK proposed 19 separate actions and interventions, of which 9 were selected to be realized as part of the Zagreb Salon. In the introduction to their application, they outlined their take on the problematics of space, which entails a gradation of space which flows from the most public to the most hidden, and it's based around the dichotomies of external, internal, public, intimate, and open, closed. The common denominator of our concept is, they explain, mixing of space, techniques, contents, and layers in order to establish a new level of existence and critical thinking.
One paradigmatic project that addressed the dichotomy of internal-external as well as intimate-public involved the placing of pocket mirrors, each one 7 times 10 centimeters, mirrors which are usually confined to personal use, onto the facades of buildings in order to make the experience of the city more intimate. The mirrors were often placed together to form small structures and were designed to put collective consciousness to the test in various ways, including to see whether passers-by would resist the temptation to steal them or not. While they gave a chance to passers-by to glance at themselves, and they also included the urban surroundings behind them, making visible and literal the inseparability of both people and objects from the wider environment. Some of the mirrors were also more site-specific, as they were glued onto the pillars between the main street and Kalčićeva Street, which, as Gudac later explained, were used as a promenade by prostitutes at the time, and the artist's idea was to offer the prostitutes a chance to check their makeup. This detail shows the group's playful and non-judgmental attitude to the inversion of the public and personal spheres.
TOK's investigation of the gradation of space in terms of public, intimate, and open-closed leads them to even declare the small opening on the entrance doors, also known as spy hole, to be a spatial filter that belongs to the domain of social forms of communication. In that sense, Gudac often refers to the poetics of space, which was the phrase used by Gaston Bachelard in his application of methods of phenomenology of architecture. In his discussion of outer-inner spaces, Bachelard also concentrates on the door, which at times is closed, bolted, padlocked, and at others it's wide open, and in that way awakens us in us two-way dream. Rather than letting the imagination flow at the prospect of open doors, the socialist citizens more probably use the spy hole to check whether there is an actual spy on the other side, as he evaluates whether or not to open the door, fully enjoying the freedom of that choice that is guaranteed by the invention of the mechanisms that negotiates between the intimate and the public.
Notably, the more common antonym of the public is the private, a topic influentially addressed by Jürgen Habermas in The Transformation of the Public Sphere, an inquiry into a category of bourgeois society, that from the early 1960s, of course. However, this category was only of limited relevance for the understanding of socialist societies, not least because of the issue of the suppression of private property and the interference of the state into all aspects of life, which was, of course, most prominent under Stalinism, but still had a legacy throughout the socialist period. It is indicative, therefore, that Tock coupled public not with private, but rather with the intimate. While the notion of private originates from the Latin privatus, meaning withdrawn from public life, and stands for belonging to or from the use of one particular person or group of people, the word intimate comes from the Latin intimus, referring to the closely acquainted and familiar. Tock's preference for intimate over private stresses one's close relationship with the space and marks a distance from the sharp distinction between public and private associated with capitalist society.
Now, this was also addressed in their action that involved cleaning of several square meters of the pavement on the main square of Zagreb. The public square was first swept, then washed with brushes by artists on their knees, as if they were cleaning their own apartment. Gudac explained that the aim of the action was to get hold of the alienated space for public use and make nobody's public space intimate. The symbolic cleaning intended to raise the possibility of the repossession of the public space of the city by its citizens. It refers to the crisis of the socialist city, which is no longer the mirror of progress and modernization, but of the fading of utopian hopes for social and economic transformation, which went hand in hand with widespread post-1968 disillusionment about the gap between the theory and practice of socialism. Tock's action suggests the possibility of reversing the process of disillusionment and remaking the relationship between the populace and the city.
Another crisis that was new and almost fashionable at the time was the experience of ecological crisis, which was discussed on a global level and came to the fore around the UN the climate summit in Stockholm on the human environment, which took place also in 1972 and actually coincided with the Zagreb Salon. Although the summit was boycotted by Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia, as a kind of third-way country, had delegates there, and there was regular reporting on environmental issues in the media during the summit.
In fact, the Croatian official magazine, Život umjetnosti, devoted a whole double issue in summer of 1971 to the problematics of human and their environment, which included essays on urban effects of ecological crisis in terms of pollution, as well as spread of urban agglomerations, and discussed the possibility of sustainable tourism at the time when tourism on the Adriatic coast was blossoming. And architectural magazine Čovjek and Prostor were constantly and regularly publishing and illustrating these new developments on the coast. The editor of the magazine Život umjetnosti was Žarko Domjan, the same person who was the selector of the section proposal of Zagreb Salon 1972. So he proposed that the theme should be human environment, which, as he said, is a major concern of our civilization.
So Group Tock were engaged with this problem, with environmental problems, directly in several of their works. For instance, the artist saw, quote, the dirt on the pavements, streets, squares and parks of the city as a sign that the public space was treated as a space of no one's interest. So they designed transparent rubbish bins that were installed in several locations in the city centre. The see-through bins showed all the litter thrown into them, and so laid bare to passers-by the picture of the environment in which he walks and also helps form. The production of waste was one of the main concerns of ecology in the 1970s, and was linked chiefly to the unprecedented phenomenon of new synthetic materials, of course, such as plastic bags that had recently started to be mass-produced but degraded very slowly, as well as to industrial waste. In their article for Telegram, the artists gave us a glimpse of how citizens reacted upon seeing the novelty of these newly erected transparent bins. They started putting their hands and legs, apparently, into the transparent bins as if they wanted to test what it was really like. They were taking the participatory theatre to another level.
The group talk also printed a postcard with an image of smoke billowing from a factory chimney, with the text, "Greetings from Zagreb," imprinted on it. Here, talk initiated discussion about the use of postcards as a propaganda tools for representing the city, and they subverted and critiqued Marshall McLuhan's credo, "The medium is the message." However, by selecting the image of a factory for their postcards, the artist also directed attention towards the problem of environmental pollution, and the factory in question was located near the main bus station, which indicates a phase of urban development of Zagreb when the industrial belt surrounding the old city suddenly finds itself in the middle of it.
So the question of poor air quality and industrial pollution were among the key preoccupations of environmental thought at the time. However, there was also a new phenomenon to be addressed, namely the spread of personalized motorized vehicles. In a letter to the editors of the Croatian architectural journal that was already mentioned, Čovjek i Prostor, from 1970, a reader complained, "A wave of motorization has gripped our country. 10 years ago, it was possible to count on your fingers the number of personal cars, except official ones. Today, our streets are crowded with cars, and every year there is less space." The phenomenon is explained by historian Ivo Goldstein, who by emphasizing the, quote, "irrationality of the Yugoslav economy," writes that in the 1970s there were twice as many cars in Croatia as telephones, because the purchase of a car reflected the level of people's personal standards, while the development of the telephone network reflected social standards. The Tok artist drew attention to the growing presence of cars in the city centre by dipping a car tyre in black paint and rolling it around the parked cars on the pavements that block the paths of pedestrians. Here, this image here is actually of another action using a tyre when they placed a tyre in the entrance to the Nama shopping centre.
The economic irrationality that fueled the disproportionate rise in car use was also inseparable from the spread of consumerism during the 1960s, with the position of non-aligned Yugoslavia between East and West making it particularly susceptible to the appeal of the American model. The beginnings of the protest can be traced to the year of 1957, when in the International Zagreb Autumn Fair hosted an American pavilion, which was inaugurated with no less ideological slogan than "The seeds of freedom bear the fruit of democracy." The highlight of the pavilion was a model department store full of the latest trends in domestic appliances, the first time such products had been seen in a communist country. 1 year later, Zagreb Fair included a homegrown exhibition on family and household, which featured 2 prefabricated department stores, both of which were later relocated from the fair into the city itself. One of them on the Praška Street, which took famously only 90 days to assemble, but was later destroyed in fire, and one which would become the Nama store on the Trešnjevka Square, also the prototype for department stores that went up in many Yugoslav towns over the next decade.
So you can see a very interesting kind of link between 57, when there's this American store is exhibited in Zagreb, then the Croatians also exhibit a store in 57 there, and then it's spreading, this model spreading throughout the country. So the economic irrationality that fueled, the public space in front of Nama in Trešnjevka was chosen by the Tok artists as the setting for one of their oversized public cartoons, which had their background cut out so that the real city surroundings could serve that purpose. The cartoon depicted male and female characters exchanging stereotypical phrases. In the artist's words, the comic leaves the format of the newspaper and is transformed onto the street, into the ambient of the town, the attention of which for the artist was to step into a direct interaction with people and confront their usual way of thinking. On the main square, they installed another cartoon where the communication was between 2 male characters and was reduced to the expression inače, which in literal translation means well, and in colloquial Croatian was used as a phrase meaning what's up. This phrase indicated for Tok the level of alienation between the citizens, and elevated this question of intimacy from the city space to that of the interactions between people.
Another element that describes the relation between people and time was the group's project to print flyers that resemble money and distribute them on the streets. The flyer printed on paper that had the standard size of banknotes contained a proclamation that read, "The city is the territory of our action, the citizen is its protagonist. We declare money to be the agency which in space and time connects people, group talk." Talk's emphasis on the power that money possesses to connect people highlights the social glue of consumerism that was displacing more overtly socialist forms of social solidarity.
The problems of the city diagnosed by Talk also reflected the crisis of the socialist model of urbanism. In the immediate post-war period, architects and city planners have been inspired by the desire to break with the traditions of bourgeois architecture, which are concentrated on building residential palaces and public buildings that were usually located in city centres, but which neglected the mass of the population on the outskirts of town. The socialist architects focused instead on the creation of new urban central points, cultural centres, amateur clubs, nurseries, health and sports facilities, and so on. The vision of the socialist city was by the declaration of the architects section of the Second Congress of Yugoslav Engineers in 1947, which called for an architecture that was not narrowly technical or utilitarian, but rather, quote, was a reflection of socialist reality enriched by new ideas. The decision to build a new city on the other side of the River Sava from the 1950s onwards was motivated by such concerns and resulted in a parade of prefabricated apartment blocks. However, as usual, the discrepancy between theory and practice was clear, not least in the fact that New Zagreb became a dormitory town rather than a new socialist city centre. Drawing attention to that problem, Tork proposed to spread a thin white thread between the old city centre and parts of the city which were, quote, deprived of the fullness of social interactions characteristic of the centre of town.
Finally, there was another level of references that Tork addressed, and that was the political crisis that the city experienced in the early 1970s, especially in the year before the group's debut on the Zagreb Salon 1972, when Croatia was convulsed by the nationalist movement of the Croatian Spring and its eventual suppression by the federal authorities. Arising out of concerns about the status of Croatian language in Yugoslavia and expressing economic grievances towards the federal center, the Croatian Spring grew in summer of 1971 into a mass movement involving demonstrations, strikes, and student protests that also spilled over into the art world. In December of 1971, Tito moved to crush the Croatian Spring by forcing the reformist leadership to resign, outlawing nationalist organization, imprisoning the ringleaders, and organizing a purge of party members and the intelligentsia.
For Tork, the over-politicization of city life was in itself polluting, and they decided to carry out an unannounced action that was not included in the list of proposals that they sent to the Salon committee. This action involved making banners for public demonstrations, with the extra twist that Tork's banners contained black and white stripes, dots, or geometric grids on their fronts, rather than the more usual contents of such posters of portraits of political leaders or the written-up demands of protesters. Tork enacted demonstrations by marching through the streets of Zagreb, holding up these canvases, which were 70 times 100 centimeters in size, and protesting with abstract signs that caused confusion amongst passers-by, and also parodied the role of art at the same time. Goodats talks about the polluted political atmosphere at the time, and states that their action was a direct reaction to questions that preoccupied them, which was concerned with the, quote, double pollution of our living space, the real physical environment as well as the mental domain.
Now, interestingly, this action was reenacted twice the following year, in Graz and in Austria as well as in Belgrade. On both occasions, it lacked its original political resonances and was more of a light-hearted act of disruption of public space. In 1973, they also traveled to the World Youth Festival in East Berlin. The idea for their participation in this festival was to cross daily to the West Berlin, which is possessors of Yugoslav passport they were able to do. Then they wanted to take slides of everyday scenes from the streets of West Berlin, and in the evening project them on the facades of the East Berlin. Now, the artists were denied slide projectors and by the organizers, and in that way they were effectively prevented from realizing their plan. After this insane socialist realistic futility in Berlin, Gudets explains, we did not want to perform in the streets anymore.
This was in fact the end of group talk, and also the symbolic end of the idealistic period of the belief that artistic actions in public space can have a social impact, with the waning of the utopian impulses of the 1960s. It also signaled the failure of the artistic mission laid out by Tok to achieve a new higher synthesis between contemporary art and urban life. Notably, the next time artists in Yugoslavia and Croatia appeared in public space, it was not to change the world, but to make the rebellious statement, "This is not my world."
Okay, and Croatian art historians have had much less sympathy for the socially critical group Tok than they had for the other interdisciplinary groups, such as Exat 51, due to their warm affection for modernist tendencies that Tok rejected. In the catalogue of the influential catalogue, New Artistic Practice in Yugoslavia, 66 to 78, their works were described as primarily transmitting a social message rather than an artistic one. Furthermore, in the equally seminal exhibition Innovations in Croatian Art in the 70s, which was organized in 1982, the talk was compared to medieval juxters and jesters, and subsequently to a group of traveling entertainers who only want to develop consciousness through their art, which takes reality itself in order to transform it. The summary account given of Tok's practice reflects the fact that although art critics were able to embrace innovative artistic approaches and could deal with the institutional critique of conceptual art, for instance, they were not prepared for artistic practice that reached out of the discipline's confines and dealt with the social and political reality itself. The difficulty art historians had in placing Tok within the canon of new artistic practice in the 60s and 70s was an indication of the exceptional character of the practice, and revisited today abounds to unexpected contemporary resonances of socially engaged art.